not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
We will not bow down.
Let my people go.
Hello and welcome to episode 49 of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast, bringing classical liberalism to South London and beyond via our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Dan Heaton and my partner in podcasting today is Mike Swadling, the co-founder of the Croydon Constitutionalists. Mike, how you doing? And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well, Dan, and of course all our listeners. Yes, obviously, despite the situation we're in, things are fine and cold. How about yourself?
Yeah, not too bad. Doing this dry January thing, although I'm seemingly doing it without actually planning to do it. I just keeping myself to myself as everybody else is. Well, we're delighted today to be joined by one-time Croydon Brexit campaigner and now the leader of the Foundation Party, Chris Mendes. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Dan and Mike. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
And it's a very special guest today. We have Duncan Forsyth, one of the main Brexit campaigners from Croydon during the referendum back in 2016. Duncan, a very special welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Mike, what have we got to discuss today?
Well, having brought back the gang together, we are, of course, talking about Brexit and the deal, and how our feelings are from back from then. We're talking about COVID and the latest lockdown, the May elections, or maybe not, as they may be. US politics has been in the news, and giving you updates, as always, from our website.
Indeed, we have a Brexit deal and we have left the transition period. Boris produced a rabbit out of the hat, or a Christmas present for us all on Christmas Eve, with the announcement that there was a deal, a free trade agreement between the UK and the European Union. It's now been looked at, and indeed has been has actually gone through Parliament within the space of a day, and perhaps we can talk about that. On the face of it, to my perspective, doesn't look too bad. No real role for the ECJ, no single market, and no membership of the Customs Union. Well, at least for Great Britain. Mike, what have you made of the deal?
I'm happy. We're out. Let's take the win. Nothing's perfect, and this isn't. The withdrawal agreement is kind of the greater concern to me with regard to Northern Ireland, but that was already baked in, and given the god awful situation Boris was given by Theresa May, there was a little he could do about that. So, but I think this deal isn't bad. There's not good for fishermen. Clearly, that's going to be the major concern. But there's lots of things about this deal that we don't necessarily like. But I seem to remember them being answers to, back in the referendum campaign, to questions we were asked on street stalls and in some of our public meetings and the like, that you kind of assumed that out of some agreement with the EU, we would still have some quite close cooperation, and that would mean some lack of freedoms in certain areas that we'd ideally have. And I certainly remember us talking about things like, we haven't got much of a fishing industry. We want to grow it, but we don't have to get it all tomorrow. It may be phased in. It's frustrating that that's after a 4.5 year period to get to this point. But do you know what? As I say again, take the win. We're free. We're out of the EU properly and at last.
Chris, from your perspective, what do you think of the deal, and does it get Brexit done?
I think in the short term, I think with respect in the immediate term, and what's the fundamental bottom line, yes, we have left, as Mike has suggested, but in a much broader, longer term, more fundamental and principled sense, I think no, we haven't actually. I think it's a Brexit deal by the Conservative Party with a an overriding priority of delivering headlines X and Y in order for them to politically survive, rather than a loyalty to the underlying pro-Brexit principles in the first place, like Mike has just alluded to, namely freedom, and I would add liberty and democracy. I think, but let's not belittle the headlines that were delivered, like you yourselves have both just mentioned, the fact that we are not going to be governed by EU laws, and the fact that the European Court of Justice and Parliament and the Commission and all of that goes with it are no longer supreme and governing our country day to day. We've ended free movement, no payment, subscriptions, membership fees, and of course we're free to do trade deals and so on. And of course those headlines to deliver were of course the heart of the disagreement between the Boris Johnson and the Dominic Cummings wing of the party and the Theresa May and Phil Hammond. They disagreed on those lines that needed to be delivered and so on. So obviously under Boris Johnson, we've got a different set of checkpoints, check boxes to tick and so on that they think constitutes a successful deal, which they've now delivered. But when you do look at the detail, I think there was a lot to be desired, and it's certainly not the Brexit that we would have agreed to and we would have liked. I would just point to one example, if I may, within a short space of time that I have. The fact of the matter is we have agreed in this treaty to various rules on the subject of state aid, competition, the environment, employment, just so-called non-regression of the EU's rules, basically, and so on. And one of these areas is an ambitious framework for cooperation on renewable energy and tackling climate change. The bottom line is that means the Paris Accord agreement, that means carbon neutral by 2050. And the whole point of Brexit in the end is about becoming a free, independent country, to have our own democracy, to have our own discussion about these things, and to determine our own rules and our own policies. But unfortunately, what the Conservative Party has done yet again, it has agreed to all sorts of other issues, global issues, incidentally, not European ones, and intertwine that with what should be a bog standard free trade agreement. So we've got a long road ahead, I think, in arguing about these points and getting the freedom and the genuine sovereignty that we should have and what Brexit is actually about. But when you've got somebody implementing something which they don't understand or really believe in, then this is what we're left with. But as Mike said, it's relative to where we were. We nearly had the withdrawal agreement and ended up being half in, half out. This is better than what we nearly got. And the bottom line is as well, is that we can terminate this agreement with 12 months notice. We can leave it and renegotiate it, which is good. Whereas Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, we couldn't. We needed their permission to leave it, which was absolutely insane. So, yeah, I'm happy, as Mike said, at the end of the day, relative to where we were, but it's not what really it should be. And I think the fight and the campaign for freedom and for democracy and for sovereignty is actually still very much on the agenda.
Well, Duncan, it took 4.5 years to get to where we've got to since the referendum. How do you feel about the deal that's been agreed?
First of all, full disclosure, I mean, I can't say I've read the deal. It being a long and rather turgid legal text, like the vast majority of people, I've not actually read it. But judging by what I've read of the opinion of sceptical lawyers that have gone over it with a fine-tooth comb, it certainly passes the sniff test, doesn't it? It restores the nation's sovereignty. It removes the role of European Court justice. So we're free to diverge from EU law and make our own laws and so on. So I'm certainly happy about that. I think we certainly got Brexit done. So it's great in that regard. I think that the main deficiency really is that we should have done far more for our fishermen. One of the most egregious aspects of when we joined the EU as it was then, the EEC was the way that we utterly sold our fishermen and our entire fishing industry down the river in our in our enthusiasm for joining. So I think we should have done far more for them. But as far as what we campaigned for, which is sovereignty and self-rule, I think we've certainly got there, and on the whole, very happy. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's taken 4.5 years, and there's been all these battles and 2 general elections since. But it seems as if some of the Labour Party are going to be campaigning to rejoin. I know there's some people have been on Twitter and changing the Twitter handle to being a rejoiner, or whatever the terminology is. But the Labour MP for Canterbury, Rosie Duffield, seems to have come out as a rejoiner and is suggesting that many of her fellow Labour MPs, including many in the shadow cabinet, feel that they will be campaigning to rejoin, and they're going to try to persuade the Labour leadership, or a future Labour leadership, to rejoin. Mike, have you seen this story?
Yes, absolutely, and it's a fabulous story for what it tells you, and frankly, what it means for the Labour Party. Patrick O'Flynn has done a great write-up in The Spectator, essentially, and it's a theme of stories he's been doing, that this may well be what's already killed off Labour's chances of winning the next election. And it may well be true. This as Duncan mentioned something earlier, it passes the smell test. It passes the smell test. You think this is right. There is a whole load of Labour MPs that think we should rejoin. And I think that was a perfectly reasonable position. When we, and I say was in the past tense, when we first left, Tim Fallon, I think, was the leader at the time of the Lib Dems, or quite soon afterwards, came out and said, we should be, we should campaign to rejoin the EU, we being the Lib Dems. And I thought, perfectly reasonable. We had a vote, we voted to leave, we leave, and then those people that want to rejoin, they can do that. That's, I don't like it, I don't agree with it, but that's democracy for you. But when you then spend 4.5 years trying to do everything you can to undermine the democratic vote of the British people, I think you lose that right. I think you lose the right to say, okay, we should, use the right to be in a reasonable position to say that we should rejoin immediately. And Labour have done that. It's going to be a terrible, terrible weight round their neck, and good.
Well, I actually, having seen the story, I listened to an excerpt from the Huffington Post podcast, which is where this story comes from. And she's asked, about rejoining. She said what she said. And she said, but we'll definitely be campaigning for a closer relationship. And the questioner said, so do you mean like single market membership and customs union? He said, yeah, that sort of thing, yeah. And then the interviewer said, so if you rejoin, would you look to join the euro? And she said, why not? I'm not an expert in economics, but why not? That is the Member of Parliament for Canterbury. I'm not an expert in economics, but hey, let's just give it a go and join the euro. That is shocking from somebody who is a Member of Parliament, that they don't know how important changing your currency is to a country, and the effect that would have on your sovereignty and everything. But hey, why not? That was her response, which perhaps shows you the quality of some of the Members of Parliament that we have at the moment, where she can't even give an explanation as to why that would be a good thing or a bad thing. Just why not?
It just goes to show how little substance so many of our Members of Parliament have. And I think this whole Brexit issue, when it broke out ever since 2015 general election in particular, when UKIP got 4 million votes. I mean, obviously this has been a 25 year long campaign ever since the Maastricht Treaty, really. But in more recent years, some of our MPs and politicians at the top of the Labour Party and the Conservative Party too no real principles, no convictions, no real great ideas, no vision for the country or for their community, really. Most of them are parachuted in as representatives of the Conservative Party or representative of the Labour Party in their constituency rather than a representative of the people in their constituency. And so when the issue and the referendum broke out, it really gave some of these people an opportunity to kind of have a little bit of meat on the bone. And they swallowed every single Project Fear line and fear-mongering kind of propaganda point and really absorbed that entirely and took it to the extreme levels we saw, as Mike alluded to, when they tried to subvert the result, which when it didn't go their way, it turns out they're actually in the minority of public opinion rather than the majority. And still to this day, they haven't learned anything. They haven't, this is all they really know. The kind of nonsense sort of propaganda and the Remain campaign is pretty much all they really know about the issue at all. And they really need to just stop it. They really need to drop it now, admit that it's over. It's over. We've left. And, you know, they really need to discover some sort of great ideal or vision that's post-Brexit, because, you know, they're only going to be, how many Remainers have been unelected and lost their seat, rightly so. And if Miss Duffield in Canterbury wants to follow her colleagues out the door, then, you know, she only needs to carry on. But yeah, I think she'd be best placed, I think, to move on.
Well, of course, there were a number of Remainer tropes during the referendum campaign, one of which was that, oh, there'll be no food on the shelves in the supermarkets. There'll be, you know, huge tailbacks of lorries, etc. Well, we've not seen that. There'll be no medicines available. Well, I'm sure we'll get onto that shortly. And of course, my favourite one was that we're all going to get super gonorrhea. Well, I haven't as yet got super gonorrhea, unless it's, of course, asymptomatic. And speaking of asymptomatic, horrific viruses, we'll move on to COVID, shall we? We here in London, we were in tier 2, then we found ourselves in tier 3, then the government made something up called tier 4, and now we're in a national lockdown 3.0, and we're going to be in that till at least the middle of February, although I believe the legislation, which was nodded through once again by our members of Parliament, actually has a sunset clause of the end of March. So we may still be in lockdown by then. However, a vaccine is being used at the moment. Indeed, there are 3 of those available, and they're being given to the elderly and those that are at risk. But yes, we're in lockdown because of the mutant strain. Sounds scary, doesn't it? A mutant strain. Apparently, it's more contagious, but I'm not so sure it's any more harmful than the previous strain. I read just earlier today that they estimate that 5% of the population of Croydon have got COVID at the moment. Although apparently the room for error in the calculations means it could be as high as 6.3% or as low as 3%. And given that the tests are very unreliable with lots of false positives, and of course, apparently you can be at a very high level of asymptomatic infection, I'm really not sure how they're calculating these things at all. Mike, I'm sure you're not overly happy to be back in lockdown.
No, Dan. I mean, this is just a terrible situation we find ourselves in. We had the lockdown last. We are 10 months now into 3 weeks to save the NHS. We had the terrible lockdown last year, and you know, things were very bad. And it's interesting now. We now have the yearly deaths for last year for England and Wales and probably other bits of Britain, but England and Wales is the one I happen to have looked at. 14% more people died last year than on the 5-year average. You know, that's terribly tragic. That's an awful lot of people's lives being shortened. They were predominantly older people with coexisting conditions, comorbidity. Sorry, but you know, still very bad. What is really clear to me when you look at the week by week average over last year is when we didn't have the lockdowns, we didn't seem to have a lot of excess deaths. When we did have the lockdowns, we did have a lot of excess deaths, and there's no evidence that the excess deaths caused the lockdowns. It does indeed seem to me, when I look at the charts, almost like the lockdowns caused the excess deaths. There is, if lockdowns worked, we wouldn't have to keep doing them. And it does feel like the government's reaching out for anything it can do to feel like it's taking positive action rather than actually taking positive action. And it's another loss of freedom. It's another loss of freedom at a time when we see the one thing we can do indoors, our online freedoms being taken away from us. I don't see us getting it back. I don't have a good feeling about the future on this. And yeah, it's too depressing for words, although obviously it's a podcast. So crack on, guys. I hope you got some.
Chris, what have you made of the latest lockdown?
What have I made of it? Well, I mean, I can tell you how I feel, which is one of great shock and anger. I think that a lockdown is a bad policy. I think it's the wrong policy. I think it does more harm than good. And I think it's extraordinarily dishonest, has been from the start. The purpose, the objective of the lockdown in the first place, if you remember, was to support the NHS and their need to obtain desperately, very quickly, the shortage of ventilators that they had at the beginning. And that made perfect sense, to be honest. We can put things on hold so that they get the ventilators that they need, so the NHS can quickly expand and we can get back on track. Well, that was well and truly met, that objective, back in April. And don't forget that the government spent about £220 million constructing several NHS Nightingale hospitals in major cities that treated in the end very few patients, if any at all. And the Nightingale Hospital in London, for example, population of around 9 million people, before shutting down, treated a total of 54 patients. Yet we're supposed to believe that the hospitals are just overwhelmed by COVID patients and can't possibly cope. I think the propaganda coming from the government is far worse than anything that we saw during the Brexit campaign. The objective has changed from protecting the NHS to flattening the curve. Indeed, we flattened the curve around about middle of June, actually. In a country with a population of around 66.8 million people, the total COVID deaths recorded at the beginning of September was 8. We had well and truly flattened the curve, but yet lockdown persisted. And here we are. We've got lots and lots of cases, and testing has gone up. Of course, we've got more cases when you test more. And I think, as Mike alluded to, I think lockdown is responsible for an awful lot of deaths in its own right. Other deaths, there's lots of people that have been deprived of cancer screenings because they've been cancelled. We've got mental illness. We've got jobs that have been destroyed, that have been taken years to build. We've got jobs that have gone, that have no sign of coming back. We've destroyed small and medium-sized businesses. We've loaded them with debt, which is going to have to be repaid. Personal debt has gone up. Poverty has gone up. Welfare has gone up. This is a disaster. This is an absolute disaster. And I don't think we've even begun to have a conversation in this country yet about the damage that has been done for decades to come. This has been a mad policy. And I just think that in the end, we are run by people that are in there supposedly on the side of freedom and independence and pro-Brexit, when they don't know the meaning of the word, who at the drop of a hat, they will shut down the economy. And I'm thinking that the establishment can do no wrong. The more power, the more money that it has, the more good it's going to do. It's a very dangerous mentality. Westminster is no different to Brussels. This is what I've made of lockdown. And I'm angry with all of them. And it just shows, actually, we might have left the European Union on terms that we are mildly happy with, but we have got all of our work still ahead of us to explain to our political class and to replace them with people that actually understand the importance of freedom, of liberty, and that actually these are the ingredients. This is the bedrock for a happy and prosperous society regardless of whether during normal times or bad, heavy-handedness and crass policy making like this makes the situation worse. And these people will not be around to pay for it. They'll be gone on the circuit tour of speech making, and they'll be back to their comfortable lives. Whereas the rest of us who lost our jobs and lost our businesses will be the ones picking up the pieces, and will be the ones with family members no longer sitting at the kitchen table, paying the price for it. And no, I'm sad and angry, and I think the government in the end has done more harm than good, and it needs to abandon lockdown as a policy as soon as possible, but it won't.
Well, I mean, as I say, the lockdown's in place until the middle of February, but we may see it continue in some way, shape, or form till the end of March. The vaccine is being rolled out to those at the top of the list. We'll see whether or not people further down the list, further down the age groups, and without any known comorbidities will have to take it. But that's, we'll see what happens with that. I noticed that I think it was Chris Whitty, one of the gruesome twosome anyway. He suggested that, yes, we'll get this vaccine rolled out and that'll all be splendid, but we might need to put some more restrictions in place back in the next autumn or winter time. What, like, you're going to do that every year because there's flu coming? I did think that might be the case, and it looks like it may well be. And we're hearing talk of the government wanting people to rat on their neighbours if they think they're having parties or what have you. And Duncan, what have you made of the latest developments?
Well, I share a lot of the lockdown skepticism that I've been hearing from you guys. I am struck by the speed and the easiness that the lockdown policies seem to have been uncritically accepted, considering that they are completely without precedent and they formed no part in our long written pandemic plan in this country. And I think that is true of right the way across the West. No country planned, in the case of a pandemic like this, to introduce a lockdown, a general quarantine, a stay-at-home order, whatever you like to call it. It was just considered completely beyond the pale. It wasn't even discussed in any pandemic plan. There is little or no evidence that they work. And of course, as you guys have already pointed out, the collateral damage is enormous, in terms of children's education, in terms of the population's mental health, the catastrophic economic effects. I'm amazed that we had one lockdown, let alone three. It really is quite shocking. Now, at least with the first lockdown, you could say that it was justified by a very high excess death figures. There was a huge rise in excess death over the summer. But that doesn't seem to be the case thus far this winter at all. Whilst it is true that the hospitals are under a lot of strain, they're under a lot of strain every winter, really. Some wag has produced a collage of Guardian headlines for every year, I think for the last 10 years, saying that the NHS was on the verge of collapse due to flu victim admissions over the winter. So, whereas we have got some level of excess death at the moment, it's not really too much out of the ordinary, really, and I'm not sure that justifies shutting down the whole of, it's not just the economy, it's society at large that you have shut down by stopping any sort of household mixing. I'm just not sure it justifies it for something that I believe, I think you've got the figures in front of you, haven't you, Michael? But I think that it's not even in the top 10 causes of death in the UK in the last year. So I think that using the what Boris called the nuclear option is just not possibly justifiable under the circumstances.
And it's interesting that I take a view of not particularly believing the cause of death, and that's because generally, you know, when people die, they die of lots of things at once, and something gets put down, and the thing that's in the news is often the thing put down, but the overall number of deaths is a kind of a factual number. I'm sure that that's accurate regardless of what they've died for. And as you've alluded to, Duncan, I mean, we had more than twice as many people dying as you would expect in April at the peak, and that was an appalling situation. And now there is something like there's something like 15 to 20% more people dying than you would expect at this time of year. Now that's clearly not good, but as again you've said, there's no evidence that lockdowns improved that, because if lockdown worked, and let's bear in mind, all of us in tier 3 or above, so we had tier 3, we had the November lockdown, we had tier 4, we're now in another lockdown. Really were in lockdown. There wasn't a right lot going on from tier 3 upwards, and the deaths kept rising. There's not. COVID has proved frankly immune to lockdowns. So what on earth is the justification to keep doing this same policy if it keeps failing? And I think it's being seen to do it. If you look at the headlines today, we see scientists calling for even stricter lockdowns. What will that be? Will I be fined for looking out my window? We can't do much more than go to the shops. Although I do note, and I wonder how others feel this, the traffic I see about and the people on the street is much greater than the original lockdown. So even if the polls say it's popular, I think the people now have caught on and realised to take the advice under consideration, which is a small step forward for our freedom.
Well, I think just linking us back to the Brexit referendum, I think we know very well that polls are often used to influence opinion rather than to measure it. I cannot believe for a moment that there's broad support for these lockdown measures any longer, when it is self-evident that they are not succeeding in suppressing the virus. I don't believe you can, short of protecting the vulnerable and perhaps helping along a vaccine. There's not really much a government can do in a situation such as this. And so, no, I don't believe the polls. I don't believe there's support for lockdowns. I think they're clearly not working. If they did, as you say, why do we need another one? It's the only thing they can think of doing. And when it comes to schools as well and children and their education, it makes me very angry. And none of this is based on science. There is no scientific evidence that shows that lockdown reduces COVID deaths. There is no scientific basis for that at all. And none of the particular measures are based on science either. In fact, even the government's own science. I mean, just looking, for example, at the Chief Medical Officer's advice going back to August, just a few months ago, on schools. I can quote it just very quickly because I have it in front of me. We are confident that there is a clear evidence of a very low rate of severe disease in children of primary and secondary school ages compared to adults, even if they catch COVID. Its percentage is about 0.1% for children aged 0 to 9 and 0.3% among those aged between 10 and 19. And on the subsequent page, of course, what it's often said when it comes to schools is that, okay, well, kids go home and they spread it to parents and to adults and so on. This is the government's own advice. And it says here, transmission of COVID-19 to staff members in school does occur, and data from UK and international studies suggest it may largely be staff to staff, like other workplaces, rather than pupil to staff. And this reinforces the need to maintain social distancing and so on. So it is absolutely crystal clear that the government's own advice on on the risk of children catching this disease and suffering from it is absolutely minuscule, and then spreading it to parents and other adults is again very extremely unlikely. And also the effectiveness of masks as well. The government's own chief medical officer advice and SAGE committee said that the evidence was very, very weak for masks, and then suddenly they are vital for our effort in tackling the virus. So even just beyond the propaganda that we hear in the media, and beyond the statements and the lies that the politicians tell us on television, looking at the government's own advice, you can see the contradictions are self-evident and plain for everybody to see. This makes me angry. It's not just a bad policy, but it's the propaganda and lies that surround it, and the lack of evidence that surround it. And it makes me more anti-establishment than ever before. And it makes me feel that the biggest threats to our society, the fabric of our lives, comes from governments, comes from within, not from without. And they say that the greatest tyrannies come from, are often said, come in the noblest of causes. And this is a classical instance. And I'm terrified now of the new power that the government, that the establishment now has when it comes to the next crisis that is going to be wildly trumped up and exaggerated. And we must, even though COVID is no more severe than any other historical disease, in fact, it's nowhere near as bad. And yet we've managed to cope with it before without locking down the entire country and destroying the economy and wrecking people's lives in other ways. Climate change in the environment, are they going to have more suppressions and more power that to suppress our lives and these noble causes as well? So I'm very fearful of the future. It sets a very dangerous precedent, and I think, as I said before, this is not good. It really isn't. We've got an awful lot of work to do to reverse our current fortunes.
Well, we've had a number of our freedoms and civil liberties put to one side over the past year, and of course, one of those is occasionally being able to vote. Well, last year's local elections due in May were postponed for 12 months, including the London mayoral and GLA elections. So they're due to take place in May, along with a whole host of other elections, local council elections, police crime commissioner elections, and of course the Welsh Assembly and Scottish parliamentary elections are due this year. Some are already calling for them to be delayed. Now the government has said no, they will not be delayed again. But of course we've seen recently that the government might say one thing and then 5 minutes later it goes, oh no, actually we will do that. Mike, are we going to see any elections in May this year?
I mean, I don't believe the government for 1 minute in what they're saying. That doesn't mean we won't see them. I just don't believe the government for 1 minute in what they're saying. I hope so. I think the Conservatives require the bloody nose that I think these local elections will give them. Not necessarily to the Labour Party, because they're equally bad, and apparently there used to be a third party. They were once in a coalition not so long ago. I can't really remember who they were. But there are a whole range of other parties that have sprung up that, if they can get their act together and get some candidates in place, could help deliver that concern. I think a lot of independent candidates will come up, and we'll just see a general depressing of the Conservative vote that shows the true feeling of some of what's gone on, rather than the slightly suspicious polling that we've seen. So yeah, we do need it, and frankly, if they can cancel this election again, it does raise my suspicion that we do get to vote again, and that does sound a little bit tinfoil hat, but you know, a year ago now, to think that we could all be forced to stay in our homes pretty much for a year, businesses could be forced to close, the President of the United States could be taken off Twitter and other social media platforms, that would have been crazy talk. So frankly, why would it be so crazy to think they're suspend a silly little thing like a vote?
Indeed. Well, obviously we've got a political party leader on the podcast today. So, Chris, what's the Foundation Party's position on the local elections in May? And whilst we've got you, what are the party's plans for them?
Well, before, I think the lockdown that's been announced by the government, as Mike alluded to, I think is definitely having a severe impact on these elections for us, but for everybody. And I mean, exactly, it's difficult to know what's going to happen, whether they're even going ahead or not. It really is. I mean, whether the lockdown will still be in effect then. It has been since last March, effectively. So I've no reason to believe it's suddenly going to be all over in a couple of months' time. It's certainly affected our preparations for them. Incidentally, we've got a very important agenda to put to the people of local communities to consider an alternative travel of direction when it comes to local government. We are based in Croydon, of course, and we are, the Croydon Council, as we know, has gone bankrupt. I mean, it's gone literally bankrupt. It's filed for bankruptcy. It's needing emergency funding from national government. This is really something that no political party in the mainstream is in a position to lecture anybody about, because they all subscribe to the same tax and spend and borrow more money than we can possibly manage and not waste and just throw down the drain. It's the same policy from Labour, for Tory, for Liberal Democrats, for councils up and down this country. They borrow, they tax, and they spend, and they waste, and councils go bankrupt or close to it. And we want to campaign on a platform of fiscal responsibility, of actually reducing council tax rather than perpetually raising it, and actually getting out of the way and stop interfering in a range of matters like planning, and making things easier for commercial businesses rather than harder to operate and to move in and to flourish, and rather than getting in the way and even taking over commercial properties and lands and trying to get involved in business themselves, which councils often are doing. Croydon being a good example, purchasing the Croydon Hotel, utterly stupid and foolish and even socialist thing to do. And it has the inevitable consequences of all socialist politics in the end leads to, which is the bankruptcy, and we paying for it. So it was geared up to be a very important election that we wanted to get involved in. But lockdown has absolutely made a huge problem for us. I mean, essentially, unlike the mainstream political parties who have a large repository of people who are standing for election, who are ready to be candidates, who've been waiting for their moment to be a candidate for a Conservative Party and for the Labour Party for many years, and they're all good to go and so on. We, on the other hand, we reach regular folks who often have never been involved with standing for election before. It's very different. We do have a number of people that do switch parties, but mostly it's people that are from the grassroots and looking to get involved and take a stand. And for those people, understandably, getting involved in an election is not necessarily their top priority right now, given the fact that we are under lockdown. Their job may be under threat. Those of their family, the business that they may very well run, their kid is not in school learning. They have to obviously attend to their homeschooling needs now to a large extent. So it's changed the personal priorities now for lots of people that had come forward and volunteered to be a candidate, and we were already talking to, but there's been a limited a number of kind of development in terms of their candidacy and giving them training that they need. So lockdown has really altered the course of this election. So we'll see how it goes. But as we say, we don't even know whether the elections are going to take place. But in a nutshell, that was our part of our platform and what we wanted to campaign on. But lockdown has certainly changed the focus of the nation at this time. So we'll see how this plays out.
Well, one of the newer parties, like the Foundation Party, was of course the Brexit Party, which came to life in early 2019 and stormed the European elections and forced Theresa May from power. The rest, as they say, is history. Well, just this past week, it's been announced that the Brexit Party has now formally changed its name to Reform UK. The Electoral Commission has allowed them to do that following their application. I did wonder whether they would allow them to do it, as a Reform UK does sound quite like the Reclaim Party of Lawrence Fox. Richard Tice, the one of the main people, the chairman, I believe, of now Reform UK, he's being touted as a possible London mayoral candidate, and I saw him on, I think it was on YouTube the other day, suggesting that he's thinking about doing that, but what he will definitely do is he's going to run for the GLA. So presumably he'll be top of the GLA list, I would imagine, for Reform UK. Duncan, I know you've obviously a keen Brexiteer, and you'll have been looking at what political parties are out there, and there's quite a lot now in the Brexiteer wing of politics. What have you made of the Brexit Party and it now becoming Reform UK?
I think now that they've lost their USP, it's going to be quite difficult for them. I think, particularly, I'd say in London, it not being the most Brexit supporting area, like the majority of the populace here might still hold a grudge against them over us exiting the EU. And as you say, the field is rather crowded now, isn't it? What with Lawrence Fox having started up his new party to fight the culture war as well. I can't see myself voting for them, but then I'm a member of the SDP, so I will be supporting them if they have a local candidate.
Oh, excellent. And thanks for outing yourself there. That's wonderful. No doubt you will become probably a spokesperson for them in due course, as I'm sure they're looking for such people. And we'll definitely get you back on the podcast in that, guys, in the future then. Yeah, Mike, what obviously there's the Reclaim, there's Reform, there's the Foundation Party. Certainly from a London perspective, there's the Heritage Party. And obviously all sort of Brexity typey parties. Obviously, Duncan's mentioned from a slightly different position, perhaps on the political spectrum, the SDP, but nonetheless, they're in the fight as well. Is a blooming crowded field, and even in a proportional representation system like we have to a certain extent on the GLA, you do feel that unless these parties work together, we're not going to get anybody on the GLA that's so we say sound.
Yeah, there is very easily a 5% vote in London needed to get someone on the GLA of Brexit supporting, anti-woke and lockdown skeptical parties, which all of these parties are. Very easily 5%, probably 10 to 15% in London. I wouldn't go higher than that, but there's very easily 5%. Unfortunately, there's that many parties that they will probably all take each other out to some extent. And that's that they need to build from. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think Duncan mentioned there the SDP. Not my politics in terms of their economics, although interestingly, of course, they are massively economically to the right of the current Conservative government. They are massively less socially Democrat than the current Conservative government. So you kind of think you're economically on the right, and that might be with the Conservatives. Not anymore. But I think the SDP is a really exciting party. Really interesting that they are half the country believes, economically left-wing politics. So, for want of a better way to put that, they believe in a degree of quite a heavy degree of governmental intervention, quite high taxes, quite high spending. Half the country more conservative, small c conservative, and most of these parties are on that economic side. The SDP are the same party where frankly the Labour Party used to be, occupying that sort of ground, or the Liberal Democrats. And I think that's exciting because half the time the other side's going to win, and you want someone sane on that side. And I think the SDP and some big profile supporters as well create a lot of opportunity there. On our side, if you like, the more socio-economically conservative side and or fiscally conservative, and certainly, there's few as fiscally conservatives, perhaps you and I, Dan. There is a few parties, and we do need to see some way of working together. There's a more important test to me, actually, which is, are these parties laying down local infrastructure? The Brexit Party never set up local infrastructure. It set up infrastructure around candidates that came and went as the candidate came and went. I don't know what the Reform Party will do. The Reclaim Party will do. We're waiting to see that. I know Chris has got a certain amount of local stuff, but also it's a relatively small party, and they're building things up. The Heritage Party, I believe, is which is David Curtin's running for, and going to be really making a play because it's an existing assembly member. They are trying to set up more local stuff. Again, they lack numbers to do that, as all new parties do, but they are trying to set it up from a local level. But are these parties setting up a legacy infrastructure that can go forward? And we were part of UKIP. We had a local organisation. We could do things at a local level, and I absolutely believe that's necessary to fight local elections. None of these parties have done it yet. They won't necessarily have it in place for May, but can they make the first steps towards that? Then I think they've got an interesting future. If they're only interested in being big names fighting on the telly, then they hurt others, and frankly, they don't show the commitment and 15 to 20 year commitment that's needed if you want to set a party up.
I just wanted to underline a point that Mike, you've just made, which was basically when we're looking at all the political parties that are on the field of play at the moment, there are, I think the bottom line is, if a serious political party that is going to succeed in providing an alternative point of view, that alternative point of view must revolve around a different attitude in society, a different attitude for the economy that spells out a different kind of relationship between the individual and the state. I think it has to, at the end of the day, if you do not have an alternative, contrary vision for the country in terms of how much money should the government take out of the pocket of the ordinary family, of the individual, how much money should it take, how much it should spend, how much power it should have, just how many of our problems must be resolved from the top and from the center in that command and control kind of way, how many of the opportunities can only be explored and pursued successfully by top, central, big, powerful government. I made the comment earlier that Westminster is no different to the establishment in Brussels. I believe that absolutely paramount, and every day proves that to be the case. Unless you have a fundamentally contrary view along those lines, economically, that you think that the government should tax less and should intervene in the economy and in the free market system less, and actually let the free market be free and do what it does best. If you do not subscribe to that, then you're not really subscribing to a contrary opinion as to how certainly how our economy should work, but how our society should work as well. The two are just linked, pure and simple. I think otherwise it is very much the status quo. You may very well make a few good points about some very important issues here and there, but unless you have a fundamental different approach to the economy, then you're not really providing an alternative future. And so that is the point that I would make. And some of these other parties do a better than job. I think SDP, for example, Duncan, I think your party is very clear on those issues. It very clear. It does, as Mike say, support a kind of interventionist sort of approach to the economy. And I think that is absolutely right, that sort of position is made clear, whilst perhaps being a bit more socially conservative and so on. That's a complete package, which we can respect enormously. But I think there's a number of parties that are not complete in that sense and need to find out and clarify exactly where they stand. And then you've got a vision to vote for between them. So that's as somebody that's been through this thought process and who's part of a grassroots movement to try to grow a new party, not just to make a protest, hold up a placard on one issue or another, but actually to provide an alternative, a real alternative to be built over the years to come. I think there's an awful lot to consider. So food for thought, but I think more parties have more work to do than others.
Well, certainly, I would be interested to see what the actual philosophical or let alone what might be in a philosophical differences, let alone what might be in any given manifesto as between, say, the Reform UK and, say, the Reclaim Party, because at the moment I just know it as one's the former Brexit Party, and I know a couple of people who are at the top of it. Of course, it has no members, famously. And then you've got the Reclaim Party, which is, we'll fight the culture wars and it's Lawrence Fox. But we've not seen any sort of overarching philosophy. As you say, Chris, I sort of know where they stand on the culture wars, but I don't really know where they stand on economics, I know Reform UK stands for Brexit because it used to be called the Brexit Party, but I don't really know exactly what the sort of economics philosophy is or what have you. And of course, there are others. So it will take some time. We will see if any of these parties merge or one subsumed into the other or what have you. But it does seem like there's a lot of parties in the field, and I'm not entirely sure what the real difference is between them. But yeah, we'll see, and we'll see whether or not there are any elections in May. Of course, there was another election back in November across the pond, and after some argy-bargy, Joe Biden has now been officially certified as the winner of the Electoral College, and so in a couple of weeks' time, he will be becoming the president of the United States. Trump has finally accepted that he is not going to continue as president in a couple of weeks' time, although he doesn't actually accept the result of the election. Well, just the other day, as the Congress was looking to certify the Electoral College result, there were some disturbing but also quite peculiar scenes at the Capitol in DC. Mike, I know you've been looking into this. What have you made of these bizarre scenes?
The scenes themselves were very bad. Protest is great. Protest is really positive. People should be encouraged to protest whenever they have the things they feel strongly about. But that needs not to spill over into acts of violence, acts of vandalism, acts of whether it's an Extinction Rebellion person jumping on a train, or BLM protesters throwing obstacles at police horses, or people storming the Capitol building. It absolutely has not to happen, and that should be condemned. And indeed, perhaps eventually, in some cases, that has been condemned. What happened in Washington by all sides. No, not necessarily all the other protests have been condemned by everyone, but there we go. Appalling what happened. And they're a bit bizarre, but I think protests are. I've always kind of taken the view that 20% of people that turn up to a protest are the same people that turn up to every protest of every side, and it turns out they're just looking to have some trouble. But when I take a step back and I think to myself, actually, a terrible election in the sense of it was run under these closed conditions. It wasn't the normal campaign event. People don't have huge confidence in it, even though I think Joe Biden won, and that's right. Terrible election. We had 4 years preceding that of the Democrats saying that the Russians fixed the previous election. We've had people locked in their homes for a year. If this is the main protest out of that, that actually shows how robust American democracy is. And terrible that people lost their lives, clearly. But actually, in much of the world, when you have this set of circumstances, there is a literal shooting war at the end of it. I think it shows how robust American democracy is. Donald Trump, who was my least favorite Republican, but was a Republican and actually done a lot of good things in office, I think really soared his reputation not giving losers consent at the end of that. And as someone and all of us who have spent 4 years fighting against a Ramon gaggle in this country who wouldn't give losers consent, I think it's a sorry end to the towel. But I am just very worried about what Joe Biden will bring.
Well, yes, I mean, obviously some concerns about what the Joe Biden presidency will mean and what it might mean for the UK, and we'll perhaps consider that in future podcasts. But one aspect this week, which I think you may have some views on this, Mike, as a keen follower of American politics, is that there were 2 runoff elections for the US Senate seats for Georgia. Georgia, solid red state, has actually gone and elected 2 Democrat senators. Very, very marginal victories, but nonetheless victories they are. Do you think that the behavior of Trump, particularly since the the general election has played into that and has actually cost the Republican Party those 2 senators. And of course, because those 2 senators are now Democrats, it gives Biden the White House, the Senate, and the Congress, and gives him a lot more leverage in what he wants to do over the next 4 years.
Yes, indeed. It was an incredibly sadly rainy night in Georgia the other day, wasn't it? These should have been Republican seats. There was every indication they would be Republican seats. The American system is broadly designed to be split across different parties. That's a very positive feature of it. If no one has too much power, everything goes slowly. Government doesn't get to interfere too much. And that's been some of the robust success of the American federal government. And that's an important point here. It's the federal government, because, of course, most powers are with the states. And the states can do a lot of things, but the federal government, trying to run what's frankly a continental empire, it gets gummed up and doesn't get to do things. And that's really, really good. They will now because and I think, Donald Trump and people associated with Donald Trump effectively calling into question the purpose of voting does appear to have suppressed the Republican vote in Georgia, and that's a really bad. It doesn't matter so much if someone wins, providing the other party has got one of the levers of power, and that's been taken away. Now, in theory, in the Senate, of course, most things in the Senate require a supermajority, so a filibuster-proof majority of 60 votes, I think it is. They wouldn't have that, but that's only if the Democrats choose to honor that requirement. That's not a constitutional requirement, that's a set of rules. They can change that. They've changed it in the past. Republicans have taken advantage of it when they've changed it. If you believe the Democrats won't use this opportunity to change the filibuster and ram through their results, you'll believe they also allow people like Donald Trump to have a platform on Twitter. And we know that's no longer true.
Chris, what have you made of the debacle that's been the US election? And do you have an opinion on how a Joe Biden presidency will work or otherwise for the UK now we're in a post-Brexit world?
Well, I think it's very similar to Mike, actually. Yet again, I have mixed feelings about Donald Trump. He certainly wouldn't have been my candidate as a conservative leaning candidate, spokesperson, president, prime minister. But he did. I think he did plenty of good things and said some things that were what needed to be said. I think on the cultural wars, for example, when he said some very sensible things that conservatives haven't said often enough. And I think a Biden presidency will reverse an awful lot of it. I think the freedom of speech is going to come under a massive attack in that country, more so than ever before. And the reason why that concerns me, it's not my country. I don't live there. I don't live under those laws. But anything that happens on these sorts of issues in America usually follows into the UK very quickly. I think there's too many people here that think the American president is our president, and politicians as well. They seem to follow an awful lot that happens in America. And their ideas and bad policies seem to end up here very, very often. And I worry about an awful lot of things, and critical race theory as well, where we have a stoking of divisions in society, where every grievance, whether it's someone doesn't succeed in life for one reason or another, doesn't have the housing or the wealth that they want, it's automatically and exclusively down to race. And we have those sorts of infantile sort of exchanges, and before you know it, we've got all sorts of positive discrimination on the legislative, on the statute book, and all sorts of policies that along those lines. And it's just stoking division rather than healing them and rendering race a non-issue. There's lots of issue. That's a huge topic, which obviously we don't have time to go into now. I think the banning of Donald Trump's Twitter account is outrageous. The fact that big tech is now seriously, I mean, it's an authority. It really is. They've got so much power now. It's extraordinary. For suppressing speech, for reasons that it chooses, and that's a dangerous precedent now. It's all in favour of the leftist narrative. Anything that's very biased against conservative. They've been wanting to shut down Donald Trump for years. So I think in the end, ultimately, it's not good. I think it's a shame that Trump's presidency has to end on this note. I don't hold him personally responsible for what happened. I have a very high bar when it comes to freedom of speech and why that should ever be violated and people held to account. He never advocated that kind of action. He advocated fighting until the end, and that is obviously being fighting in the courts and filing suits, which he has done for many months now, and holding press conferences with Rudy Giuliani, giving update reports on how they're getting on. He's failed because he hasn't had the evidence, and understandably, rightly so. And I think in the end, there's nothing in the claims of mass fraud. I don't believe him at all. I think he lost fairly and squarely at the end of the day. I think fraud was at a low scale, at a local level, a little bit here and there, but nothing to. He lost a popular vote by 7 million votes, and then loses consent. In the end, he didn't. He didn't have that, as Mike said, and it's emboldened the left massively, and it's done great harm, I think, to his own cause, to his own platform, and you've got Republican Party supporters fighting, scuffling with police officers. It's really bad, and it's emboldened the left, and it's going to mean an awful lot now going forward. So not good, and it's not good at all, and I fear for what's going to happen over the next 4 years.
Well, Duncan, obviously you've come from a slightly different perspective at these things in terms of being a member of the SDP these days, but what have you made of it, and what do you think will come from a Biden presidency from a Brexiteer's perspective?
Well, I mean, who would like Donald Trump? He's brash, he's boastful, he's mendacious. You certainly wouldn't want to go down the pub with him for a pint, would you? But from a left-leaning perspective, I mean, his foreign policy was the best of any president in my lifetime. And one of my favourite statistics at the moment is that he's the first president since Carter, which I think I might have been a little baby when Carter was in power. He was the first president since Carter not to start a major war, which I think that makes him a lot more worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize than certainly Barack Obama, whose administration bombed more countries than Bush. So, in that respect, in the foreign policy perspective, I would say that Trump was extremely left leaning, whereas Biden, I think, I fear that we might return to the bad old days of the forever war, really. I mean, he was obviously a part of Barack Obama's government, and as a result of the military intervention there, Libya is now a failed state. So I fear it will be more of the same. And for that reason, I was kind of hoping that Trump would win this election, really, even though I don't like the guy. What I was really hoping for, you see, was a Trump Sanders face-off, because I think both either president could have been trusted not to adopt an overly bellicose foreign policy. So I'm a bit fearful for the future in that regard, and also as has been previously mentioned, I think that it will embolden the both the woke left's censoriousness and tech and big tech's censorship as well. So I am currently pretty fearful for the future. Now, I think that as you guys have already said, Trump should have conceded when all legal avenues were exhausted. I think he was well within his rights to question the results in the courts. That's not without precedent. I believe that Bush only won after quite a contentious legal challenge over Florida. So I mean, I do think that there was quite a lot of fraud in that election, but then there is always fraud in every election. I don't really know whether it altered the result, but certainly once all legal avenues are exhausted, Trump should have conceded rather than acting like a baby, really. So in that regard, it was all a bit embarrassing for him, really, and it will undoubtedly affect his place in history, which is a bit of a shame after doing so much for world peace.
Just quickly, Dan, reiterate something Duncan said there. First president since Carter not to start a major war. That's something you're not going to hear on the mainstream media, and that's a really, really important point Duncan's raised. Every president, and often for seemingly good reasons. I think it's superpowers sometimes do need to intervene, and people can differ on the use of the word need there, but do understandably intervene. But there are, frankly, hundreds of thousands of people more alive in some of the developing nations in the world that would not have been alive had Hillary Clinton been president, and that's I think that's quite an important achievement of the President Trump.
Indeed, and I understand he brokered a few peace agreements between Israel and some of the neighboring states as well, which is not bad going for somebody who was so vilified and over the past 4 years. But yeah, we'll see how Biden gets on, and we'll no doubt touch upon that in a future podcast. Well, Mike, we've got quite a few articles that we've put up on the website and other pieces that people can have a look at. Why don't you take the listeners through those?
Yes, absolutely. Some great articles on the website. So, firstly, we asked, and you responded, and you've responded brilliantly. I've written to, I suspect, many people who listen to us and some others about what they thought of Brexit and was Brexit done. A few questions, basically setting out, saying, did you think Brexit was done? How do you hope the UK will use these freedoms? What constitutional reform would you like to see next? And what do you think is next for the EU? Over 20 people have responded so far. There's probably more to come. It's been published over a number of articles. Have a read through. Fantastic to read what so many different and diverse ideas of Brexit and what people want to see next has come on. And it does show how successful the referendum campaign was in uniting people with different political persuasions. Yeah, really, really good. Have a read through. If you didn't get a chance to answer, send them in. We'll publish more. Looking forward to that greatly. I was interviewed recently by Sputnik Radio, and the title of the article perhaps gives an indication of how I felt. The vote for lockdown is insanity. The economy is on its knees. So you can listen to my interview with Sputnik Radio. It's up on the website. I was also, just before the turn of the year, interviewed by French radio, and there's an article mentioned the interview in Le Telegram, a regional newspaper of sort of the Brittany region in France. That's up on the website. There's a quote to some of the audio, though it's in French, but not my bit. I hasten to add. They were asking me about what we thought of the referendum, and some quotes up on the website, worth having a little read of. But if you've heard enough from me, you might want to listen to or read an interview from Helen Spipley Van. Apologies to Helen, I've probably got her name wrong there, of the Christian People's Alliance. She's been a candidate for the Christian People's Alliance a few times now in Hornsley and Wood Green. She talks about being a candidate, some of the policies of the party, some of the things that drive her interest in politics. A really interesting read, someone that's been there and done it a few times. Particularly if you're interested in getting involved, it's worth reading. Quick quote from her here. It's inspiring to see how deeply people care about making the world a better place and fighting injustice. We all have this much in common, even if we disagree about how best to do it. And I think some of the subjects we've covered today. That's a really good quote. And lastly, on the website, and it was Chris mentioned it earlier about Croydon Council going bankrupt. Well, you can tell some of the pigs that have had their snouts in the trough. The Taxpayers Alliance have published done another great piece of work, publishing the local authority councillor allowances for 2018-19, which is the last chance they've really been able to get all those figures together for. And it shows the allowances of Croydon's councillors. Now, Croydon, that went bankrupt. I'll just remind you of that. That went bankrupt, was paying its councillors on average per councillor, so it takes into account different sizes of authority, the 11th highest in Britain, the highest in London, and the 3rd highest in England. They were paying absolutely top dollar for the people that bankrupted Croydon. Have a read through that. You can see how they compare to other areas. It's an appalling situation. Now, given their due, they have cut their allowances since then. They have cut £300,000 from their allowances, but outrageously, this still leaves the bankrupters of Croydon in the top 20% of the country and the top 6 in London. Have a read, write to your councillor if you don't think the people that bankrupted our borough, the people that will cause an increase in your council tax and will see the cutting down of key services are worth being paid in the top 20%. I certainly don't, and I'd encourage you to do all you can to get in touch with them. All up on our website, have a look, and if you're not sure where it is or there's some stuff you want to write to us about, please do get in touch.
Yeah, so if you'd like to write for the website or have any stories you'd like us to cover, please do contact us. You can do so via the Twitter at Croydon Const, via our Facebook page, via our website, croydonconstitutionalists.uk, and via our email, croydonconstitutionalists@gmail.com. Well, do please subscribe to the podcast and the pubcast. One day we will return to the pub. Do please also subscribe to the YouTube channel. Do please like, share, and leave a review. It's always good to get feedback, and it helps others to find the podcast. I'd like to thank both Chris and Duncan for joining us today on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you guys again. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Stay safe, everybody.